Welcome back guys, JimmyJules153 here. I've had a few requests, so today I'll be going over a bit of how I made Blade Gunner. I won't be going over the logic in depth, but I'll be showing you some of the techniques that I've used to get all this working. This is Blade Gunner in its very early stages. The first thing I had to work out was the circular plane. We'll go through how this all works soon, but first of all I'll just take you through some older footage. A bit further into the project, we've now got some enemies, and a few more of the core mechanics down. You can see here there's still quite a few issues, like the ship being knocked off its axis by collisions. I then worked on a few more enemies, and also worked on improving the visuals with some paintings. I then did a bit of work on the UI with the score, boost, and combo bars down the bottom, and added in some of the city buildings. We've also got a basic wave system. Next came the eyeball in the center of the stage, and then adding a bit of an intro to the entire scene. I then got to work on some of the more special effects with the boost and with the power-ups. We've also got some placeholder music now in the scene. Then I got my hands on the final game music from Rigorous Mortis. A seriously huge thanks to you, Rig. The game would not have been the same without the music. By this point, we're getting quite close to the final game. With the next update, we had the shop introduced, which allows you to build on your power-ups from the main menu, and I had ironed out most of the bugs. And we are now at the release version of Blade Gunner. So I'm sure the first thing you guys are wondering is how the circular plane works, and I'll show you that now. If we just turn on the connectors view option there, we can see that each of these things is on a connector, and that connector's center is in the center of the stage. Everything that's moving on this map is on a connector so that it stays on the circular plane. If we turn on preview and visibility, we can see we've got a few blocks running around the circle, and these are emitting enemies, but along the circular plane. This also goes for the bullets. To keep all of these objects on the same plane, I set up a rig with two cubes that are joined by a connector. I've then duplicated this setup and used it for every single one of the enemies. I've moved the part that the object rotates around, or the pink part, into the very center of the map. This way the object will rotate around the center of the map. I'll just take you through a bit of how the enemies are emitted now. Normally these blocks would be traveling very quickly around the circle, but I've just slowed them down so that we can see what's happening. I've just got the logic pinned to the screen here for this little red block that's bouncing up and down around the circle. This block is responsible for emitting the mine enemies, so the ones that sit still. I've basically just got a random number generator hooked up to a keyframe, which moves the block up and down vertically. To get it to move around in a circle, I've just put it on a motor bolt connector, so the connector itself moves it. When this block receives a signal from the main chip to emit an enemy, it triggers the emitter, and the mine gets emitted. We've also got a trigger zone on this setup that is set to detect the player, and this trigger zone disables the emitter, so it doesn't spawn the mines too close to the player. I've also got a bit of stop motion in here for the eye. It's basically just a heap of sculpts that are all stacked over the top of each other. Each of these sculpts has the eye ripple in a slightly different spot. So if I pull it apart a bit here, you can see the eyeball is actually multiple sculpts, all grouped into one, and it just activates one of these at a time. For the painting on the eyeball, I've just made one line in the pattern that I liked, and then I've used the clone feature from within the tweak menu to clone it around in a circle. Now we'll just go through a bit of the logic. So on this chip here, we've just got some of the shop variables. These variables hold the upgrades that the player has purchased. The variables are then read on the ship and activate their respective power-ups. This is the tutorial here, just on this one timeline, and it's basically taking us through the different instructions. So you can see at the moment, this keyframe is active, and when the playhead hits that keyframe, it moves it back a bit, so it sort of keeps it within that little loop. To do this, you'll need to make sure that your keyframe is not on the timeline to begin with. While you're in record mode, grab the timeline playhead while you're holding shift, and then move it to the location that you want. We've got some logic in here to turn off that keyframe and let it pass. So for this part of the tutorial, we're learning to move, so it wants us to push the left stick up, down, left, and right. If we push the stick down, it will turn on one of the counters, which activates a keyframe to turn the text box green, and also satisfies one of the conditions on our AND gate. If we then push up, right, and left, it will complete all of the conditions on the AND gate and turn off the keyframe. Once the keyframe is turned off, it allows the playhead to pass. Then it'll run into the next keyframe and repeat this process. So we've got a very similar thing here. If we push right on the right stick to shoot, it'll turn the arrow green, and left will turn that arrow green, and then it will let the playhead pass. This just continues until we've finished all of the stages of the tutorial, and then once that's all over, it'll update the have done tutorial variable to 1. This is so that it doesn't show the tutorial twice. On this chip we have the waves and the enemy spawning logic. You'll see down here each of these transmitters is responsible for spawning one of the enemies. They'll send the signal to one of the blocks that's flying around the stage. I'm using a randomizer to spawn them, and I'm changing how many ports the randomizer has based on which wave the player is up to. This way I can decide which waves the new enemies will be released at. So for example, if the player is up to wave 6, it will activate port D on the selector and send a value of 6 into the number of port slider. This way it slowly allows more enemy types to spawn, depending on which wave the player is up to. Over here I've just got the score and the combo logic. I'm using trigger zones for this because they're able to detect more than one thing in a single frame. This means that if 2 enemies die in the same frame, the trigger zones will be able to detect this and adjust the currency, multiplier, and score to account for the multiple enemies dying in the same frame. This chip here is responsible for changing the colors of the lights at the bottom of the stage. It just randomly picks between 5 colors, and we've put this through a signal manipulator to blend the amount of time that it takes to transition. This is the boost painting, which is the painting that gets emitted while you're boosting. I've got this painting being emitted continuously while you're boosting, so it just emits heaps of copies of it. All this fleck does is expands and then destroys itself. There's just so many copies of it that it looks like a solid line. You would have seen in the earlier videos that the ship was basically colliding with the enemies and knocking it off its axis. To avoid this, I made the ship totally uncollidable so nothing can collide with it whatsoever. I've then made these 2 duplicate ships, and both of these are collidable and follow the player. They're also invisible so you can't see them in play mode. They basically sit right above the player's ship, so that if anything was to collide with the player, it would instead collide with the invisible sculpts, which avoids the ship being knocked off its axis. Basically everything in this scene is a duplicate of some sort, so each of the rings in the stage is a duplicate, each of these buildings is also just a clone, all of these cubes are the same sculpt so they don't take up any extra graphics thermo whatsoever, and I've even used the ship's sculpt for the life indicators and for the shine behind them. I've also used a heap of paintings in here. You can make some awesome special effects with paintings, and they can really add another level to the graphics of your game. Each of these paintings gets emitted after an enemy dies or at a certain point. The stars as well are of course all paintings. This includes the galaxy in the background, and also the top border for when you get close to the top of the stage. The boost and the combo bar down the bottom left are also paintings, and these just have a text box in the center of them to make the center look solid. Anyway guys, that's just about all for this one. If you've got any questions at all, definitely leave a comment. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.